way you can have anywhere that you want. Hey, good morning. You want to be here, sir? It's good to see you today. And everything's working. Joey, it's good to see you. Thank you, my digital pastor. How are you? You good? Stay around. That's good. Yeah. You guys will come up. Sit on the other chair. Linda said she was They're downstairs in the lower level. They were not tired.
And Slow down. We have no idea what's going on. Give him a moment, give him some perspective. We don't know the story. And he's not crazy mistakes. Okay? Don't do that. Yeah.
You'll go ahead and get started because I think probably hard to join the
Well, why don't we, you and I start talking around 12:20. And give folks a minute.
So I'll just ask you to start off that we don't like to think of the time before our school years but if you start way back there and tell us a little bit about where you came from.
Sure. Well, I was born in New York City in Flushing Hospital. My mom, when she immigrated to the States,
We're getting some real noise on the microphones.
Sorry, not my expertise. Oh, look at that. All right. I was born in New York City. My mom was 6 months pregnant when she immigrated from Korea. That was October. I was born in January. But we didn't live in New York for very long. My dad and his dad got into an argument, and so he decided to just drive south. They drove south. My grandmother, who always takes her child's, who had always taken her child's side over her husband's, drove with us. And so they drove south, and it was between like going straight down to Florida or taking I-10 towards Houston. And my grandmother thought, oh, if you live too close to beaches, your kids won't study. And so we went to Houston, and my parents went to like one of 3 Korean restaurants in Houston. They asked for the phone book, opened up the Korean phone book, found the first Presbyterian church that they could, and called the church up and said, hi, we're here, can you help us? And they did. The person who met us was my best friend's dad. So she's currently still my best friend, lives in Pleasanton. We were roommates in college, and her dad came and met my parents. He was the, let's see, like cousin-in-law to the pastor at that time. So, yeah. I grew up in Houston. I did like kindergarten through 12th grade in Houston, so I was there for a long time. But within Houston, which is a fairly large city, I moved around a lot, so I had a lot of different schools that I went to. But my church friends were like my constant friends, right? And so I got to have like one set of friends that stayed the same throughout all of those formative years. And then my school friends changed a little bit more.
I can't imagine going from school to school to school. And, oh my goodness. I love the story that you've told about visiting a Caucasian little friend, and that you noticed at the last minute that they were wearing their outdoor shoes into the house.
Yeah.
And saved you from taking off their shoes. Do you have immigrant stories that you share that would be relative today?
Yeah, I mean, so my parents, we went to a small Korean immigrant church. And so there was about, 200 folks, and a lot of those immigrant churches end up being not just a faith community, but like your extended family, right? Because, my dad didn't have any sisters or brothers in Houston. A lot of folks didn't. And so, I went to work with my parents when I didn't have school, right? Like, that was part of what we did. I was told that inside the house we would only speak Korean and that I could speak English outside of the house. I have friends who had to go to ESL even though they were born in the States, right? So English as a second language because they were brought up just speaking their home language. I did a lot of translating for my parents, so when they had parent-teacher conferences, I would always sit in on them so that I could translate for them. And of course, I was always a really lovely student.
You could edit.
I can edit, that's right. That's right. And yeah, I had some friends through like Girl Scouts and other groups that I may have been a part of, mostly through like friends' moms who could take me to things where I go and visit. It's like, oh, parents are at home when you wake up and when you come home from school, and that wasn't our life. My parents worked. They left for work at like 6:30 in the morning, and then they would come back around 8 o'clock at night. And so I was a latchkey kid since I was a first grader, and spent a lot of time alone. I had an older brother who did his own thing literally. He's 8 years older than I am, and so in an emergency, my parents could count on him, but he's kind of lived a very independent life.
So before we get to seminary, college and seminary, was there ever a time that you felt drawn to an occupation other than ministry?
Well, I grew up in Houston where, it's the Bible Belt, even though I think Victor was like, Houston is not the South. Somebody said it's not the South, because it's a big metropolitan area. But I did grow up like in the Bible Belt. I went to a Presbyterian church. It was a Korean Presbyterian church within the denomination that Calvary is in, but it was very Baptist feeling. We had lots of revivals, and I gave my life to Jesus at least 10 times. It was like altar calls, and so it felt very Southern Baptist because of like the water that we were swimming in, but also because I think when Koreans immigrated in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, those who were Christian took a brand of Christianity that was stuck in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so for them to be church was to look like how it was back at home, right? And so, while maybe, communities that had been here a long time were more willing to maybe change and reform and embrace different ways of doing church, embrace different kinds of theologies that might be more inclusive. I think a lot of the immigrant churches kind of were stuck in that kind of faith tradition, right? To be faithful to what they had come from. So I actually didn't see women in ministry growing up. We didn't have women who were elected as elders, definitely didn't have women who were pastors. My first female minister that I saw was when my youth pastor came and was ordained. He brought his youth pastor, who was a woman, and she preached, and that was the first time I had seen a woman preacher. And that was like, and I understood she was a preacher, but I was like, she must be different. It somehow, you know, like there must be something about her that makes her special so she could do this. So, I mean, I never imagined I could be a minister. I thought about being a teacher. I liked words and reading. I thought I could be a lawyer. I actually went to law school and quit. And when I was little, I used to say, I don't know what I want to be or do when I grow up, but I want to be a mommy. That's all I
We can tell.
Yeah.
So if Rose were suddenly grown up and said she wanted to go to seminary, what would you tell her?
Oh gosh. Really? I think that would be exciting. I was able to sit with my family and worship today, and I think Justin, in the call to worship, said something like, God is here. And she said, God is where? I mean, I think that would be really great. I would support it, but I imagine and would hope that seminaries look different than they do right now, right? Because that's 15 years from now, and the church is changing, so I would hope that theological education looks really different to serve the needs of the church then.
So tell us a little bit about your seminary story.
Well, somebody who is really near to my heart, who actually Marcy knows, is my pastor Sean, and he was the first PCUSA minister that we had as a youth pastor. All of our other youth pastors came from Dallas Theological Seminary, and I don't know if you know Dallas Theological Seminary. Yeah, very conservative. I mean, they were like, you need to throw out your CDs. And I was like, it just really very fundamental. And so then to have a new pastor come and be really kind of open to say, like, what are you listening to? And why does that music move you? It was like, oh, like, I didn't know it. And he connected me with the denominational church. That's where I met Marcy as a teenager. It's where I saw like women in leadership, people being really authentically who they are. Sean was my youth minister from like my sophomore year until graduation. And then he began a young adult ministry, just young, like a second generation Asian American young adult church in Houston, which was like a startup in a new worshiping community. So when I graduated college, I started law school back in Houston and joined that church. I hated law school. I hated every minute of law school. I'm like, why am I here? All I do is read these stinking, like, I was unhappy. So I met with him and I said, Pastor Sean, I hate what I'm doing. I feel so lost. What should I do? And he's like, you could go to seminary. And I was like, I need a real job. And part of the reason I went to seminary is because my parents struggled financially when we were growing up, and I wanted to provide for them in some way, right? And I thought law school is one way that I could make money. It turns out when I went to law school, it became really clear all the jobs that you make money from in law school were not the jobs that I wanted to do. And I was like, oh, I don't want to stay here. So, but I felt like I did need a real job.
Not a lot of people go into the ministry to make money.
Right, exactly. But Sean suggested I go to seminary. He kind of like said, well, if you do 3 years of law school and decide that you don't want to be a lawyer, I'm not sure that's the best 3 years spent. But if you go to seminary and decide you don't want to be a pastor, there's still so much you can do because you'll always be a part of the church, and the church always needs theologically trained people. And I was like, okay, well that gives me 3 more years to decide what I really want to do. Push that decision down the road and start seminary. And Sean's pastor, who was the first female Korean American woman that I ever saw preach, was actually now the dean of students at a seminary in Chicago. It's a Presbyterian seminary called McCormick. And so he was like, I think, for who you are and what you need, you'd be really supported because Mary is there. So that's where I ended up. I went to McCormick.
At McCormick.
Yes, at McCormick, in the south side of Chicago, in a very, very, very urban area. where I could walk to everywhere, where there was winter all of a sudden. I had only grown up in Texas, right? So like, people are like, this will be easier if you buy snow boots. I was like, oh, okay. And actually, Mike and I were dating at the time, and he couldn't find a job in Texas and found a job in Chicago, and he moved out there 6 months before I did, and so it's kind of nice to have somebody I knew there. But I lived in housing there, and McCormick, I don't know if you all know its reputation, but it was like really, really progressive. It was giving health benefits to same-gender couples at that time, which was, early 2000s, before the Presbyterian Church said like any of this stuff was okay. And I was like the sheltered, super conservative girl from Texas who just didn't even have the words to describe some of, I thought to be a Christian meant a very specific thing.
You were the girl from the non-South.
From the non-South, yeah. And they used to call me the international student from Texas. And, we actually, there were couples who lived together who were same gender, and my seminary roommate, Sarah, who I lived with all 3 years, she was like from Southern California with the hippie parents. She was a vegetarian. I was like eating Spam and like whatever processed foods. I'm still not really but it was such a stretching experience. And my first seminary introduction was an Old Testament professor talking about the story of Babel and the Tower of Babel, and how maybe the story that we have been told as children is not quite how we might understand it now when we look at the cultural history of the story, right? So he's going through this, and I'm like nodding, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And then I walked out, and I cried so hard for so long, because I was like, what does that mean if, this story that I thought was like this can be interpreted a different way? Does that mean everything's gonna fall apart, right? And that whole first year, I cried almost as much as I did in law school, but it was a better. It wasn't like I want to quit. It was just like a breaking down of who I was and what I thought my faith meant, and kind of a rebuilding. And Pastor Sean, I called him, and he was like, oh! He was like, well, if you think of your faith as like blocks, and one of those blocks comes out, things can fall apart. If you think of your faith more like as a rubber band, like it has room to stretch, go back, and like you allow space to get different. And then if you're like, what, I'm not comfortable with that, you can kind of bring it in too, that you can kind of define how big and how wide and how inclusive that rubber band is. Then it doesn't fall apart. You can hold it together. And that was really helpful as I really just deconstructed my faith
So it was a gradual process, then moving from the arch conservative. And what made, other than Pastor Sean, what made that possible? How did you do that?
Yeah, a lot of it is relational. Right, and so especially for kind of where I moved on my theological journey about LGBTQIA folks, it was just my friend JC saying, "Well, I'm gay," and I was like, "Oh," I'm like, "Okay," and just like meeting people and realizing like this is not a theological issue I need to figure out. This is about human beings and people who I love and who want to serve God, and who the church is saying you can't just because of your, sexual orientation. And so, but it was also, McCormick provided classes where you could look at scripture and hard texts and just really try to put them in its historical and cultural context, and then try to interpret things. Like, they weren't afraid to really just break it down for us, and that was really helpful to be able to, because of how I grew up, to like look at, they weren't like saying, don't look at this, you know, like, we now believe this. It was very much like, we're gonna address some of these, what they were called clobber passages at the time, right? They were like, because they were harmful. We're gonna dissect them and see what they say in its cultural perspective. Is it really saying what we think it is? And so having those tools were helpful, but it was mostly relational.
So, and Mike was in Chicago for most of, so we know a little bit about the your Mike story. What do we not know?
He's not here. He's taking care of the other kids. Yeah, so weeks ago. So Mike and I met in 8th grade band. I had just moved middle school, so it was a new school to me. I was so cool that I played the tuba. You know, every middle school boy's dream to have a girl who plays tuba. Just imagine. But it was 1st period band, and I really loved school, and I loved learning. I even really loved school supplies, but I was going through a phase. My 7th grade year was tough. Kurt Cobain died. I mean, it was like a lot of stuff that was happening that was like hard. And so I did some rebelling my 7th grade year. So I showed up to the first day of 8th grade with no school supplies because I thought that would be cool. Like, let's show up. And so I asked Mike, can I borrow a pen? He was like, sure. So I like wrote down stuff on my schedule with his pen, and then we were just kind of friends. We had like mutual friends all through 8th grade and high school. He asked me to our freshman homecoming. I said no. He asked me to our senior prom.
Why did you say no?
And I said no. I just was not feeling him. So I will say,
He's so cute.
he is now. Really thin when I met him. He was really skinny. But I think part of it was Mike is really independent, and I really like it when people need me. It's like, and I was not at a healthy, good place in my life where, you know, I could be like, oh. Because I confronted him in our 8th grade band home, and I said, I hear you like me. And he was like, yeah. And I was like, it doesn't seem like you really feel like you want to date me. He was like, I mean, if you want to. And that just wasn't good enough. There was this other guy who very clearly was pining after me, and I was like, I'm going to date him because I feel like he needs it. And I'm not But he was
So when did your friends begin to change?
We were in college. It was my junior year in college, and he moved in next door to where I was living, and we shared a wall. And so he and I were like there for the summer, but our roommates weren't, so we were hanging out, and I was like, oh, we shouldn't date because this just seems too convenient. Like maybe we would just like fall for each other because it's easy. And he was like, I don't care. If this is happening now, or it's gonna happen now. So we've been dating since we dated since I was 20. And then we got married when I was 26 and started having babies at 32. So
Where did you get married?
we got married in Chicago. So right after I graduated from seminary, we got married.
And I'm sorry, people have to listen to my voice. Do you want to drink? Nothing else. So, say it's 2042, and the kids are back home for dinner because they have flown the coop.
Well, they won't do that, will they?
Another couple of years, you're going to say, when did they do that? So what are the questions that Austin and Rose and Joey are asking, or the news they're sharing around family dinner in 2042?
Gosh, I don't know. There are things that I would like because I feel like we're done having babies, so it'd be great if they could bring babies into our lives. But I don't, you know, they
Grandchildren don't always do that. Kids don't always.
Exactly, yeah, they might not, and I want them to live a life that is meaningful for them in whatever way that means, and I think I'd just be glad that they were all home all together, and I would hope that they have a connection to the church, that I didn't drive them away from faith.
So what's the hardest and the easiest thing about raising children in the church, other than the fact that we all feel like they're ours? I mean, we lend them to you, but.
Yeah, no, I think that's the best part of it, is that, I think it's easy when you have kids to think like, these are my kids, you know, but from the beginning, with Austin, he was born in Minnesota before I started here at a church I had been serving for 4 years, and like anyone was willing to carry him and to take him, and we were happy to just like, yes, you know, and I was doing youth ministry there, and I took him on a mission trip at 6 months old, and I had like 16-year-old boys who were ergo waiting for me, you know, and it's just like, dude, you know, like I'm happy to share that, and so for us, it's always felt very communal, like the raising of children. And when we were at home, I would say to Mike, I do not think that raising kids is supposed to be for 2 people. And so, you know, once we moved out here, and Austin was about 2, his parents moved in with us because it was just, it made sense. It wasn't supposed to just be this like one nuclear family unit. Like we've always felt like we needed a village, right? And the church has been that for us, and his parents have been that for us. My parents, before COVID, would come out and help in different kind of ways. We were grateful for their presence.
It is all of a sudden time for other questions, so I'm going to throw my last question because I liked my last question. If you were reincarnated as a non-human, a creature, what would it be?
Probably a panda. Yeah. They don't do very much but eat. That's kind of how I am now. It just seems like a very chill life, right? Like they're endangered, so people want to make sure they're taken care of. The babies are so cute. They sit and eat bamboo, and they can be giant and nobody minds. I can see myself being a panda. But they can be fierce when they need to be, you know? Yeah.
Okay. Jen.
Joann, I'm really curious, because the process you went through with your faith journey, how did your family, your parents in particular, who raised you in this more conservative faith, how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so Jen's question is how to navigate kind of the faith that I had with my family and all of that, and to navigate the changes that I went through. I know my parents mostly know that I moved theologically because of the way I choose to vote and the things that I say. But we've never had a direct conversation about that. Mike, who has also seen me on that same trajectory, right? So in college, I worked for a EV Free Church, which is a First Evangelical Free Church, which is also like no women in ministry, but hey, we're gonna let you be our summer intern for youth and stuff like that. He saw me on this trajectory, and it was hard for me because I have a lot of emotions and I had to deconstruct a lot, and I would tell Mike, like, it sometimes feels like I have no idea who I am. I can't recognize myself right now because it's so different from who I was. And his response has really grounded me. He said, I mean, you kind of seem the same. You want to love God and love people. And that's always been the same. It's just the way you understand how to do that is different now. So you're living into that, you know? And so having that kind of be the center of it, or like, this is what I've always wanted to do, is to love God and to love people. And I thought doing that was to be this way. But now I've learned doing that probably means being this way. It was really helpful. Also, I realized that a whole lot of people around me were not were being careful around me. And once I was much more progressive in my theology, I was like, oh, you are, it's like people were coming out all over me about their faith, right? And I think, when you're a young person and you're growing up in the church, all these leaders that you look up to, they actually probably do have a more progressive faith than you do, but you don't really realize it because you only understand your faith to be a certain way and assume that everyone else must also believe that, So actually Sean is a lot more progressive than I thought he was, different people, yeah.
Jason.
One main question is, a few years ago when you were ordained here, one pastor gave you a title. You are living it, Pastor Mom. And on the side, does have a interracial with Mike, because there were some tension even among Asian about, especially your parents, were they open or they took a while to adjust to having Mike as a son-in-law?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So,
could you restate the question?
yeah, the question talked a little bit about Teresa saying that I'm now a pastor mom, right? This, as I was being installed here at Calvary, I had an 8-month-old, right? Austin was 8 months at the time, or maybe a year, and just her saying you're a pastor mom. This is like the role that encompasses who you are in a lot of ways. And then about just intercultural kind of things, and if my parents were accepting of Mike. So I dated Mike for a year before I told my parents I was dating him. So I told them, hey, I'm dating Mike. I think maybe we might end up getting married one day. And my parents said, you can date whoever you want, but you need to marry a Korean. All right. The next year, I just wanted to let you know I'm still dating Mike. We dated for 5 years before we got married. And now we're so glad you married Mike. You'd be such an embarrassing Korean daughter-in-law. There are just expectations about what a Korean daughter-in-law should be, right? Like, she cooks, she takes care of the kids, I don't know. And I hear some stories from my friends where it is true. There are these, not every family, obviously, but there are just these expectations that come with it. I have none of those things. I will say the first time my mother-in-law cooked for us, I felt a little bit uncomfortable, like, should I do something in the kitchen? Now I'm like, hands off, I don't even go in there. Mike cleans up, and yeah, they're really grateful, and actually they still tell me, like, don't go work in the Korean church. For them, working as a minister meant like living in poverty, living at the beck and call of everybody else around me, and that's how a lot of the pastors I grew up with were like, their lives were not their own, and they're like, you don't have to go to church this Sunday? Like, what is this? And like, you get vacation, and you're getting a sabbatical? What does that mean? They're like, never leave. They didn't know that ministry could be so abundant, I think, because it was like really carry your cross kind of mentality. And yeah.
I've had several in-laws, and none that I could have had move in with me. So I'm curious how that works so seamlessly for you.
Well, it was harder when we lived in the first place we moved to in San Francisco, which was big for San Francisco, 1,200 square foot condo that had 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, huge for the city. But it was clear when I got pregnant with Rose, I kind of looked at Mike and said, I love your parents, I want to keep living with them, but I can't do it here. And so when we moved to 19th Avenue where we live now, they're in our in-law unit that's connected, but they have their own little kitchenette, they have their own bathroom and space, and that really helps, just a little bit of separation. But I would say, if you want to get along with your in-laws, it's really helpful to marry a family that doesn't speak the same language that you do. Things don't get translated, right? And Mike is smart enough not to translate everything I say or everything his parents say. So, you know, the little things that might just drive you nuts, that your in-laws might say all the time, or the little criticisms or questions that you know, that kind of wear you down. I don't get that. You know, like, if there's something big we need to communicate, we'll do that, you know, but I don't get sort of like the daily nagging things that sometimes kind of wear you down and whatnot. And they're really laid back, so.
So what is their language?
They speak Cantonese, and I speak Korean and English. My kids speak Cantonese as a result of their grandparents living with us, which is great, so.
Did somebody else have a question? I thought I saw a hand, and I didn't want to.
So we talked about music a lot with the other counselors, and we talked about your tuba playing. What other role has music played in your life?
Thanks, Sally. This is a question about music, the role that it's played in my life. I love listening to music, and my mom sang in the choir, so when I sit and like listen to choir singing, it reminds me of like sitting with my dad in the pews and listening to my mom sing. I went through a whole grunge phase, right, with Nirvana and Kurt, but it felt like, and I moved past that because I realized I'm really not even that cool. Music speaks to my heart, and I actually grew up in a church that did praise and worship songs. And there was something about praise and worship songs where you sing the same thing over and over again, where you stop singing the words and you just start believing the words, right? And Taze is kind of like that too, right? You sing those same lines again and again, and at first you're just singing the words, but then they become a part of you, and it feels like you believe it. And so, music at my grandmother's funeral held it together until we started singing, and that's when I cried, right? Like, there's something about music that's super cathartic for me. And I like singing, but I like singing really loud, like sometimes off key. So, my mind doesn't work the way like some of our music people do, but I really appreciate it, and I like music that speaks to the heart. And sometimes grunge was that. Sometimes it's Mariah Carey. And
Yeah, I can't see that well. I'll see a hand.
I'm curious about your reference to playing the tuba. And, well, two things. Are you bass-centered as opposed to treble-centered? And second of all, did you double on sousaphone?
Great questions. I played the tuba because I could not play the trumpet. So I started off playing the trumpet, and the band director was like, try this, and gave me like the biggest mouthpiece in the world. This might work better for you. So, I don't know. I don't think I'm necessarily bass focused. I just could not hit any of the high notes on the trumpet. And then I did not play the sousaphone. What I did in our marching band was I was part of the color guard. So I can spin a flag and run across a football field. Probably not now, actually. Football field now. But yeah, I love being in the marching band. Our Texas marching band was really good. We won state multiple times. Yeah, so, like, again, so cool. But yeah, I love being a part of marching. I love performing, and actually, as you get better in color guard, you like start spinning rifles and sabers and things like that are more intricate. But I totally,
The flaming thing.
well, no, we never did flames, but yeah, they get like harder and harder, but I'm not like the most ambitious person in the world, and I'm like, you know what? I do this okay. I don't need to add to it. Like, I'll just stick with this. So, yeah. And my parents, the first time they came to, they couldn't come to a lot of things, but they never came to a football game, but they came to like a night show, just like to get a taste of what I do. And they looked at me afterwards and was like, if you want to quit, you can.
They did go and say, and it would make us very happy.
Yeah. I think they were just like, we're paying for that. Michael, did you have a question?
Oh, it was kind of taken. I was just going to say, after your triumphant debut with the three pastors singing in the Holy Holy a couple months ago, do you have plans to
Oh,
sing?
yes.
No. I mean, I do plan to sing, just not into a mic. I would be open to doing that communion liturgy again, because I think it's really pretty. And I practiced it and found the song on YouTube and listened to it multiple times.
Maybe you could write something for Joann.
Why not?
Joann, I think your sermons are so thoughtful and so well assembled. I'd like to know what your process is for writing a sermon.
Thanks, Amy. Well, we wanted to give something an associate pastor, is like you don't have to preach every week, right? And I have friends who, it's that relentless return of Sunday, and the Sabbath is like, every week they have to think of a new sermon. I have more time to kind of sit and stew with the passage, I'm preaching next week, but I've known that I'm preaching that scripture for like 3 or 4 weeks. And so I can sit with it and kind of pray on it and look up stuff and, use it or not use it. One of the reasons I didn't want to be a pastor was because, one, I'm terrified of public speaking. The first time that I did public speaking as a 3rd grader, I stood up, fully intended to make my speech, but cried and sat down. Like, yes, I just really didn't like public speaking. And preaching is not public speaking, but it is being in front of people, right? And I wasn't excited about that. And I used to think preaching was telling people what you know. And I was like, I don't know anything. I mean, I got ordained I was 27. And I was like, what am I going to tell these people who have had faith from before I was even born? Like, there's nothing that I know that I can share with people, right? And so I was like, I have nothing to offer. But I had a really amazing preaching professor. Frank Thomas is a Black preacher from Memphis who taught a class called Preaching as Celebration. And he thought that preaching should be a moment to celebrate, right? And he said to us, you cannot preach what you don't believe, right? So it wasn't about what you know, but about what you believe. And that if you don't believe it, don't say it, because people will see right through you. I think part of me finding my voice in preaching was admitting that I have a lot of questions and a lot of doubts, and trying to be really transparent about that so that I'm being honest to my own faith and then sharing that instead of trying to share what I do know, because it's not a whole lot. But yeah, I usually, I do all that back work and then I write, and I'm usually done writing within 2 days. I just kind of sit and get it all out. And it's a very verbal thing for me. Like, I have to speak it out loud, and I'm typing it as I'm speaking out loud. And when I edit it, I'm reading it as if I'm like preaching, and then I'll change it up.
So you probably shouldn't write your sermons in Starbucks.
No, I know. Yeah, and I'm not one of those people who like needs the energy of other people as I write stuff. Yeah, even if I like say it with Mike They're really gonna like put his headphones on.
Saw Marcy or Victor for feedback.
No, actually, we don't, because not all of us finish our sermons in time for feedback. I generally do. I have friends who like will write their sermon up until Sunday morning or Saturday. I have way too much anxiety to be that way. Like, I usually have a sermon done at least by Thursday. That's, and if something happens, I might change it up, but, yeah.
I just wondered if you had a magic wand, what would be your wish for Calvary? Maybe you could get 3.
Oh my gosh. That just opens up a whole lot. I feel like, as a pastor, my personal wishes for Calvary are not as important as all of your wishes for Calvary. Yeah. I have wishes, but I just,
Don't let her off the hook, friend.
sorry.
Not gonna let you off the hook.
Well, with housing, I think it would be meeting the needs of this city that is definitely on the cusp of, and has been transforming for a long time, and not necessarily for the better, right? Like, there are things that have been good about the changes that the city has gone through, but like housing, it is sinful that we spend so much to live here, right? Like, I met with people this week who live all over the country, and they're like, so how much did your place cost? And when they heard, their jaws dropped. You know, you can get a 2-bedroom for $1,000 in different places in the country, you know, that, and you know, it doesn't have to be like that, but to struggle so much just to survive here seems wrong, right? I think like San Francisco was like this boho chic, like artsy place, and like artists can't really afford to live here either, you know, and so this idea of like, you know, returning to some of those roots of like being weird and eclectic and,
So maybe it's, would be more a matter of discerning the wishes of the congregation.
Yeah.
How does the congregation do that?
oh,
I mean, I remember the mission study, the 2-year.
yeah. I know, study is hard, and it's very Presbyterian. You know, I grew up Presbyterian, but really mostly Southern Baptist-ish. And so, like, sometimes you just have to go and do it. You know, like, go and do some of the stuff, and it's like, oh, like, that's a good fit or not a good fit. So trying is okay and good, and can allow us. And I think it's also like listening to each other, right? Of like, hey, I did this, it really fed my faith. And I do think that's how we've gotten to some of the partnerships that we have now.
Okay, I don't know. Run over time because we're told not to do that in the Presbyterian church. But do we have one more question out there? Or do I get to ask the one? I've asked all of my most challenging questions. So I'm watching those little people back there. What are your biggest hopes for those little people, for Austin and Rosie?
I think especially for Austin, who is like sweet and cuddly, he's like our sweetest child. The other two are a little bit of a firecracker, but like my wish for Austin is that he doesn't have to change to fit into the world, but that the world will change so that they can accept who he is, right? You know, I don't want for him to like feel like he can't have feelings or cry or get hugs, you know, like that. And sadly, I think our society does that a lot to young boys and men, right? Where like it can no longer be that way. And I hope that he has the permission to just be who he is. Rose and Joey.
And thank you for